Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Begin Center weekly Zoom event held for English speakers. We're returning after a short summer break, and we're going straight into an issue which I think will become increasingly, which will I think focus more on in the coming weeks. The Israeli elections, which are 2 months away, almost exactly 2 months away now. And we are going to discuss, I think, in future weeks, some of the more specific issues pertinent to these particular elections. But what I wanted to talk about today is, I guess, the kind of elephant in the room as we are approaching what is the fifth election in about 3.5 years. Those of you who pay attention to these things, who can bear to pay attention to these things, will recall that 2 of the previous 4 elections failed to result in the formation of a government coalition. They simply led automatically to new elections. The 2 that did ultimately lead to coalitions led to coalitions which were of remarkably short duration. One of them was for about 7 months, one was for about a year, I think. And we are now heading into election number 5. And whilst it is certainly true that there is a specific issue at this juncture in Israeli politics, the issue of Netanyahu and the fact that the country is split more or less 50-50 on whether he should be prime minister or not, and that seems to be the main dividing line in the country right now. Nevertheless, there are also structural issues. There are elements of the Israeli government system, political system, which are sort of baked in, which exacerbate the problem and perhaps prevent us from finding a way out, or block some of the ways that there might be to get out of this impasse. So to discuss those things, I have someone who will give us the benefit of his considerable expertise, knowledge, and insight. Before I introduce him, just very quickly, for those who are new to these Zooms, a little word about the format. My guest and I will have a conversation of about 30-40 minutes, after which time I will turn to your questions, which you can write in the chat at the bottom of your screen. Please do write those in as they come up, and I will make sure I put some of those to our guest before we conclude after about an hour. Okay. Let me introduce actually a returning guest, Dr. Shany Mor, an adjunct fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies and a research fellow at the Institute for Liberty and Responsibility at Reichman University, where he also teaches political theory. He served formerly as a director for foreign policy on the Israeli National Security Council. He has a PhD from Oxford and was a postdoctoral fellow at the Political Theory Project at Brown University. Shany, welcome back.
Thank you very much for having me.
So when you were on about a year ago, we were talking about the decline of the Israeli left. It was part of a series we were doing looking at sort of important moments in Israeli history or important factors that have shaped Israeli history. And today, I think we're looking at something which afflicts the entire political spectrum, which afflicts the entire system. The various ways in which Israeli politics and governance is somewhat dysfunctional. So perhaps to start with, you could explain to us what are some of the specific problems you see, and maybe highlight especially those which you think might be contributing to the current crisis, the current situation. That's a big question to start with. You can point to 2 or 3, and we can go from there.
Right. It's a big question because I'm a bit reluctant to overdiagnose any major constitutional problems. We have a parliamentary democracy, and we have governments that serve when they have the confidence of parliament. We have a whole bunch of procedures in place that are supposed to make it easier to do that. Many of these procedures that we've invented over the years, what they have in common, they have 2 things in common. One is they emerge from a kind of lesson learning. Something has happened. People are unhappy with the result, and we're very quick to create a new rule that's supposed to prevent that specific thing from happening again. I would venture to say it's even less an overlearning. And the second thing that nearly all of these various reforms have in common is they've never worked. In fact, they often have unintended consequences that are much worse than the problem that they sought to solve. Perhaps later in our conversation, we can go through some of the specifics, but I only say that as an introduction to explain my reluctance to make a great big diagnosis about any fundamental institutional problem that then you inevitably would ask me to propose a solution for. So that's by way of introduction. Politically, we are, of course, at an impasse. And we're at an impasse because we don't seem to be able to arrive at a clear reckoning on two issues which are interlinked. One is the political fortune of Mr. Netanyahu, and one is the legal situation that he's in. And a clear result on either of those things might ease the logjam a bit, but I don't for anything of the like on either front in the near future.
Okay, so I mean, one of the things that has often been proposed, and I think actually the thing which most people think about when they hear the talk of reform, is reform in the way the voting is done, because people look at the Israeli system, especially I think perhaps Americans who are, I think, probably represented in large numbers in this audience, both Americans still in the States and those living in Israel now, who come from a very different political system. What's interesting about a lot of your writing on this is that you very specifically said that you don't think that that is the issue that we should be focusing on. And you don't agree, for example, in raising the electoral threshold, which is something that's frequently presented as some kind of, either panacea or at least something which will improve matters. You don't think it will improve matters?
No, I think it's actually one of the reasons why we're in the current predicament we're in was a rather poorly thought out decision to raise the electoral threshold from 2% to 3.25%. I'll explain that in a second, but I'll first say about the various ideas of electoral reform. So besides being somebody who writes and comments on Israel a lot, I'm also a political theorist. And so I'm encountering always people in my academic field who have plenty of ideas about institutional design. And what's hilarious is everybody, particularly people who know a little bit about Israel, has a wonderful idea for making our electoral system better. And usually it amounts to some kind of way of making people vote for good people and not for bad people, or tricking them into voting for better people and not for worse people. And it's somehow built on the assumption that bad people know that they're baddies and good people know that they're goodies, and that they're just not being able to coordinate correctly right now. And every couple of years, there's some trendy reform that comes from this institute or that one, with varying degrees of cynicism behind them. And I mean that sincerely. Sometimes they're extremely cynical and self-serving ideas, and sometimes they're really not. The latter one actually scare me even more than the former. And the concept is, we're going to redesign the way you vote, or we're going to change some rules about how governments are formed or how they're disposed of. And this is what's going to make it so that it all works. Whether it's a direct election law, whether it's a constructive no confidence, whether it's the rule that the leader of the largest party forms the government, whether it's now we have new ideas that have come up just in the last couple of weeks from some very august institutes and institutions about having a supermajority for dissolving parliament, or about having the budget vote no longer be a confidence vote, et cetera, et cetera. Almost all of these are designed to salve the wound of some recent trauma, and very few of them have any real possibility of working. What has worked for Israel in conditions that are really extremely challenging, what has worked for Israel is having a very broad basis of representation in a country that is very, very divided on issues of religion and ethnicity and war and peace, and has every single challenge you could expect a democracy to have, whether it's multilingualism, whether it's waves of migration, whether it's terrorism, whether it's a complicated international position. And for 74 years, by having everybody or nearly everybody represented in parliament in one way or another, we've managed to conduct our very, very, very deep political disagreements in a country with very easy access to weapons in an almost uniformly nonviolent way, with some really big exceptions, but actually in the grand historical sweep of things compared to other countries, including countries in a much better situation than we were, much less violence in our political disputes, and much fewer threats to our fundamental constitutional order. A lot of these reforms, and especially the ones that come from the English-speaking world, have a very, very extreme frustration with the broad basis of representation in Israel and all sorts of interesting solutions. Many of the solutions imagine problems that don't exist. And now, if you'll allow me to transition, unless you want to jump in here, to the discussion of the threshold, which you raised.
Yeah, please do.
The electoral threshold in Israel was once 1%. It was, and it was 1% for decades, in fact. Then it was raised to 1.5%, and very quickly afterwards to 2%. And then in 2014, a new law was passed, raising it to 3.25.
Sorry, just before you continue, I want to just make sure that everyone on the call understands what we're talking about when we say the electoral threshold. Okay, so what we mean is the percent of the vote that a party must attain in order to get representation in the Knesset. So as Shany said, the current percentage is 3.25%. So any party that falls below that 3.25% of votes cast does not get represented in the Knesset.
Right. Now, there are other countries that have a threshold, by the way. There are many parliamentary democracies that don't have a threshold at all. Your threshold is you have to win one seat one way or another. There are other countries that have a proportional threshold, some even higher. The two kind of most cited examples are Germany and New Zealand. There's a huge difference between Germany and New Zealand on the one hand and Israel. In Germany and New Zealand, you have to have 5% to get proportional seats, but they have mixed member systems. If you win a direct seat, a direct mandate, then you're automatically past the threshold, even on your proportional seats, right? And that's true in both New Zealand and in Germany. And even if you're in Germany, even if you manage to fall below the threshold, for example, the FDP fell below the threshold in 2013, because it's a federal system, they didn't just get wiped out. They were still existing in the various constituent states of Germany, and they managed to bounce back and re-enter parliament at the very next election. Now, what happens here, by the way? So when I cannot tell you how many times as a grad student, I would encounter very, very smart professors who would find out that I'm from Israel and tell me, oh, Israeli parliamentary system is crazy. You guys have to raise the threshold because you have so many tiny parties in there that are holding governments hostage. And even I believed it until I started looking at the numbers. And I realized that this notion, that we had way too many parties was not true, because we had roughly the same number of parties as most of the parliamentary democracies. Throughout Israel's history, it's usually been roughly around 12. And if you know anything about Israeli society, that pretty accurately represents the main cleavages in Israeli politics. Two, there weren't a lot of small parties holding government coalitions hostage. If you look at the size of coalitions, again, over the course of Israeli history, in almost none of them were they just over the line with one party that was able to bring an end to the government. And three, and most importantly, for the discussion of the threshold, whatever situation there was, it wasn't happening because of the threshold. Particularly when in the years when the threshold was 1.5% and 2%, there was almost no electoral action near the threshold. There weren't parties just squeaking by. The threshold wasn't interesting and wasn't relevant to the result. There were parties who were below 2%, all sorts of single issue and extremist organizations that are outside of parliament precisely because that's what the threshold is supposed to keep out. But the idea that there were a bunch of parties squeaking by is largely myth. There weren't. Then we had this brilliant idea to raise to 3.25%. In fact, the idea was proposed when it was in Yesh Atid's platform. It was to raise it to 6%. When Lieberman adopted the issue, it was to raise it to 4%. We have a memory of it, which subordinates the issue of subordination of the threshold to.
Oh, we seem to have lost our speaker. Let's wait for him to come back. I think this is a first. While he's gone and we're waiting for him to come back, I'll just explain for those, because I wanted to ask him to explain, but I'll just clarify. When he was talking about mixed member systems and he was making the comparison with Germany and New Zealand, what he was referring to was systems where they have both a proportional system like Israel's and also a direct constituency system, like a system where you, like in the UK or Canada, where you are elected by a direct vote.
Am I back on?
You're back on, Shany.
I apologize for that. I don't know what happened. I don't know where I got cut off, but I'll try to retrace. I kept talking.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, you were talking about how the how it was how Yesh Atid wanted to raise it to 6%, Lieberman to 4%. Eventually, it was settled at 3.25.
Right. Now, in the sort of polarized memory, this is all seen as some kind of dirty trick from Lieberman to keep the Arab parties out. But that's almost a coincidence. I mean, the idea of raising the threshold wasn't a particularly right-wing idea, and it wasn't just Lieberman. He's the one who eventually accomplished it. But it was bubbling below the surface on the left, on the right, especially actually by people who call themselves center. It was not a very ideological idea, and it was seen as something that was going to bring stability. Well, they raised it to 3.25%, and let's ask ourselves, what happened? Did it bring stability? I would actually argue that if there's one procedural change that brought us to the deadlock we're dealing with today, it was raising the threshold. It was a solution that was chasing a problem because there wasn't an issue near the threshold, and suddenly now there is one. In every election since we've raised the threshold, and there's been 5, the threshold was raised in 2014. There have been 5 elections since. In every election but one, 4 out of 5 elections, what determined the result was coordination failures around the threshold. We took a place in the electoral rules where, as I said before, there was no action. And when I say, as I said before, I'm not just referring to this evening. I wrote an article about this back in 2013 about the Israeli electoral system, where I talked about the threshold, and I said there's no action by the threshold. And I was asked by the journal that printed it in 2019 to revise my article. And I said, I have no changes to make except for that one line where I said there's no action by the threshold. Now all the action is by the threshold. In 4 out of 5 elections, what determined the result was what happened around the 3.25%.
Just to sort of flesh this out, and so that people understand, if you follow the discussion around the coming election, most analysts will tell you that what will likely determine whether or not Netanyahu, for example, is able to form a government is whether Labour and or Meretz pass the threshold, right? Or whether, for example, on the right, Yamina pass the threshold. So it's all about, as you say, it's all about whether 1 or 2 or 3 parties get into the Knesset or not, and get 4 seats rather than 0.
Rather than 0, and that's why you get the combined list right now of Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. That's the perennial angst about Meretz in every election, whether it passes, about Ram, and in fact, most hilariously, what happened with Yamina Hadash in 2019, where they got the absolute worst result you can get in an election under the rules, which is 3.24%. 3.24%, let's be clear, is the worst result you can get. It's much worse than 2% or 1% or 0, because it means all those votes have been wasted to your bloc. What determines the outcome in each election, 4 out of 5 elections, has been the whims of parties that today have roughly between 3 and 5% of the public support. This was simply not the case before 2014. We took a non-problem, gave it an inventive solution, and created a problem.
And one of the things,
but it gets worse.
Go on.
Sorry to interrupt you.
No, go for it.
It's so much worse than even that. It's so much worse than even that, because in order to deal with the increased threshold, we started making all of these technical joint lists, right? So parties that thought they were in danger of not passing the threshold run together as a joint list with another party, sometimes with 2 or 3 or even 4 parties. That's brought in to the parliament actually people who the old threshold kept out.
Right.
That gave us a situation where, for example, with the Arab parties, you now had a gigantic joint list where the most radical element had a veto. That, for example, and let's be very clear, we mentioned his name already once, Ben-Gvir. Ben-Gvir is somebody who was never able to enter the Knesset under the old rules. The old threshold took care of him just fine. And what happened with the new threshold is that in the old threshold, if you lost 1%, it wasn't clear that that necessarily was what was going to hurt your bloc's chance, because you didn't want to lose the 1%, to be sure, but the price you paid for appealing to that one very radical 1% was often larger than the benefit you would get. And so both the center left and the right preferred to ignore them. But once you're talking about 3.25% and several concatenations of 3.25%, you can no longer ignore it. So Ben-Gvir, who is safely ignored by the right wing, now when he has the potential with Otzma Yehudit to cost them their majority, has to be brought into the fold. The very thing that the threshold is supposed to do, and successfully does in Germany and New Zealand and in a few other countries that have them, which is to keep out the worst and most anti-democratic, anti-constitutional elements of politics. Raising the threshold in Israel did the opposite. It now brought them in. We took a person like Ben-Gvir, who could safely be ignored for the last 20 years, and he's now a legitimate member of Knesset, going around from parking garage to parking garage and taking out his gun, setting up makeshift offices in all sorts of friction points, using his parliamentary immunity. He's now in the running, potentially, if the right has a majority in the next election, to be a minister.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I don't see how this reform can possibly be seen as having been a net positive. It solved a problem that didn't exist, created a new problem, and didn't even do the very thing it's supposed to do, which is have a threshold on the most radical and anti-democratic, anti-constitutional elements in Israeli politics. That's just one example. Go ahead.
Yeah. So you mentioned the piece that you wrote back in 2013. It was for a British journal, Fathom. I want to quote. There's just a sentence you wrote in that. You said, "Israel's real problem is not the proliferation of tiny parties, but the growth of medium-sized parties, and in the last 2 decades, the decline of large ones." And then you go on to make this very useful sort of distinction in Israeli election history, where you have this first phase before 1977, before the election of Menachem Begin, in fact, when you had one large party, Mapai, and the Labour Party in its various iterations. And then you have a second phase where you have 2 large parties and several smaller parties, Labour and Likud, essentially. And then, as you say, from 1996 onwards, you have what you say a smattering of medium-sized parties, you no longer get. I mean, you no longer get what you used to get, which is parties, a Likud or a Labour, certainly not Labour anymore, but a Likud or a large party getting 40 or even nearly 50 seats. That doesn't happen. So can you say something about that problem? Why you think that happened, and if there's any way of addressing that problem?
There's one big cause among many for why that happened around 1996, and that's the direct election law. That was a catastrophic electoral reform that was supposed to give decisive majorities, it was supposed to give us more governance, it was supposed to give us more stability, and it completely emptied the 2 parties. But there's some other larger things that happened that are part of global trends, and I would skip to the end and say, I wrote that article in 2013, but in a certain sense, that trend has stopped. If you look at the most recent elections, there have been a series of elections now where there have been 2 rather large parties scoring over 30, something that we thought was permanently gone. And which has not broken the deadlock. But of course, there was a deadlock when you had 2 large parties over 40 in the elections of 1981, 84, and 88. But yes, the direct election law definitely did that. There's 2 other things I think that have really weakened the large parties. And both of them are from reforms that were made with the the greatest of purest intentions, not cynical reforms at all. One was a very technical reform that began in the 1970s in Israel, which was disconnecting local political parties from national ones. And so you had a lot of local governance that was done on independent parties or parties that were satellites of larger political parties, but weren't often connected. It's not universally true. Likud, Shas, Meretz, and now Yesh Atid actually do run in local politics, but almost nobody else does. But what that's meant is that you don't have a reserve, you don't have a backbench really within the political parties of people who are dealing with real political issues and gradually working up the system before they come to Jerusalem and become members of Knesset. The way to get to the Knesset, it doesn't actually involve local politics, doesn't actually involve growing in the party, doesn't actually involve owing anything to the party or having any kind of two-way allegiance between the politician and the party, either ideologically or even just in terms of your job professionally. And what instead you have is usually getting there by being a media star. And that, of course, leads to the second reform, which has not just happened in Israel, but been almost universal and almost been universally catastrophic wherever it's happened, which is the invention of primaries. Primaries have really emptied out political parties of content and have made sure that the only way you can survive in politics is to essentially make a media whore of yourself, and particularly in Israel, where starting in local politics doesn't help you at all. And especially in Israel, where we do have a very acute problem of an extremely small parliament compared to the rest of the world, where a given political party's list is only going to get 8 or 12 or maybe 20 seats if it's one of the big ones, the only way to survive is to be as telegenic and provocative and shallow as possible. The parties that have managed to do well recently in the last couple elections have circumvented this process, either by not having primaries at all or by officially having primaries in the party, but then joining with other lists or having all sorts of reserved seats for the leader. The primary process has been really destructive. But again, let's zoom out and look at all three of these things, right? Three very, very well-minded reforms that I think have had bad results. Disconnecting local politics from political parties, from national political parties, introducing primaries into the political parties, and raising the threshold. In all those cases, it actually made the national political parties less responsive, less democratic, less stable.
Okay, so before we go to questions from the audience, and I know a few have already come in, if you had a magic wand and you could sort of change things to make the system function better, function more effectively, and address some of the critical issues that you see, from what you've said, we can ascertain that you would lower the threshold, that you would end primaries for political parties, that you would return the connection between municipal and national parties. What else? I know from conversations we've had, and also from listening to you and reading you, that there's also some interest. You also have some, I think, important things to say about the way legislation works, especially basic laws, Israel's sort of quasi-constitutional basic laws, and also the fact you've already mentioned the fact that we have a relatively small Knesset. Can you say something about those things, about the legislative stuff and the actual makeup of the Knesset itself, and maybe also the coalition? I think you might also have something to say about the size of a coalition.
Yeah, gladly. I can answer all those things. So first of all, in terms of the hierarchy of basic laws, I think there needs to be a clear hierarchy of basic laws over ordinary legislation. The way to achieve that, though, is very, very difficult, particularly in the absence of a written constitution, and I don't think Israel's ready for a written constitution. The two ways that usually are considered for solving this issue, I think, are very problematic. One is supermajorities, and one is referendums. So a supermajority would be to say, instead of, ordinary legislation needs half plus one, and if you're going to make a new basic law or amend a basic law, you need, 70 MKs out of 120, or even 80, or whatever, anything like that. Interestingly, in Israel, in order to delay an election, if an election has been called, and you need to delay it, that requires 80 out of 120. And that's used once in 1973 when an election was supposed to take place during the Yom Kippur War. That seems about the right threshold for something as severe as that. But what you have right now are parliaments that pass basic laws with simple majorities that in the basic laws entrench themselves. So there's like the Basic Law Jerusalem, which was passed by a very tiny majority, but that makes it so that 80 MKs are necessary to change the status of Jerusalem, or a referendum with a certain percentage, or all these things. And that's highly problematic. I think referendums are not the way to go either. What I do think works, and doesn't exist very much in the world, I think it exists in Sweden, is just that a basic law or an amendment to a basic law goes into effect after it's been passed by 2 consecutive parliaments. In other words, you can't change it in a sitting parliament, and that somehow intervening between when it's voted for the first time and when it becomes the law of the land, there was some kind of election. I think that's a good thing that would happen in Israel, and much better than a written constitution, which is a hugely problematic endeavor. But since it's so unrealistic, I won't explain why. That's regarding basic laws. Regarding the size of the Knesset, it's way too small for a country of soon to be 10 million people. It's one of the smallest in the world, and it's unable to do its job. Even when governments aren't large, when they have a normal number of ministers, 20, 24, something like that, when you add up all the ministers and deputy ministers, you already get to at least 30, usually much more. And they're almost all members of parliament.
Right.
When you take the committee chairs, you then get it. It is today impossible in the Knesset to be a member of Knesset from a party that's in the coalition and be a simple parliamentarian, and not be either a minister, deputy minister, or committee chair. There just aren't the numbers. In fact, it's almost impossible to be a member of the opposition in that sense. There's nobody to do actual parliamentary work. And there's an enormous amount of work that MPs need to get done. But if you, Paul, were an MP right now, or a member of Knesset, your only hope of survival, because of the primary system and because there are so few spots, is to get one of these, either to be a minister, deputy minister, or at a minimum to be a committee chair, and hopefully be on TV, maybe for saying something outrageous or stupid. And I think that incentive structure is really, really problematic. You asked me about the threshold. It is true that I opposed raising the threshold, and I think it's been a disaster. You ask if I think it should be lowered. Probably, but I'm not sure. I mean, it's one of these things where a lot of the damage that's been done is irreversible, just like with the direct election law. I don't think that if we lowered the threshold to 2%, we would suddenly get rid of Ben Gvir, for example. Right. One of the tragedies of that reform is that it created something there that's irreversible. Yeah. I think it happened with the direct election law, which, by the way, was reversed, but the incredible shrinking large governing party was a permanent change. I definitely oppose primaries. That's for sure. I definitely think that local parties should be part of the national parties. And there's one big thing that you haven't mentioned that I'm a big believer in, which is that a certain percentage of the public financing for political parties must be earmarked for research divisions. By the way, people don't realize this, that Israel has one of the highest, most generous public financing of political parties in the world. We always tend to think of Israeli political parties as being really poor and shoestring affairs compared to the world. They actually are doing quite well from public financing compared to all of our North Atlantic counterparts. They do get money from the state, money that's allocated based on their size and outgoing parliaments and things like that. And there are conditions attached to public financing for parties, including, by the way, conditions about gender equality and things like that. I think it would be really nice if the parties had to earmark 20% of their finance or 30% of their finance to policy research divisions. What I would not want to see is, and maybe I shouldn't say this because I've made a career out of it, is the think tank model. I think there's a place for think tanks, and they do an important thing. I'm worried that all of the serious policy research happening in Israel will be happening in non-governmental organizations that are funded by all sorts of foreign billionaires with their own worldviews and their own biases and their own prejudices. And I'm not sure that's a particularly effective or healthy way for us to be coming up with policy ideas. If you're a political party especially if you're a political party that's in opposition, this is your chance to spend the next 3 to 4 years getting the best brains you have, coming up with new ideas, and then figuring out a way to market them, win an election on those new ideas, and when you do win that election, to implement them. And right now, most of the public financing of parties goes for campaign purposes only. And most of the policy research, like I said, is done outside of the political parties. The political parties have been emptied of content, which is why the big ones shrink.
I mean, famously, Likud hasn't had a political platform at an election before. I don't know how many elections.
It hasn't.
Which
is a kind of platform when you think about what it's saying.
Right. Okay. Right. Thank you very much for answering my questions so fully. We've got a bunch of questions here from our audience. So I'm going to start with. So Marion wants to see MKs responsible and accountable to the people who vote for them. So what about that? Something we haven't discussed is the fact that in Israel, members of Knesset are not voted directly. There's no constituency system like in the UK or similar in Canada, Australia, and other places, or like in the United States with members of Congress, members of the House. How is that something you would like to see? Is it realistic?
I'm very nervous about it because that would be an enormous reform with a huge number of unintended consequences. If we have a much larger parliament, I'd be willing to see something like the New Zealand or German system where
a mix.
Exactly. I'd be very, very cautious about it.
Okay. So
sorry. But I would like to see more accountability and responsibility. I wonder though if there are other ways of achieving that.
Okay. Here's an interesting question from Jeff Dow. He says, could you talk to the tendency of parties to campaign right and govern left? A former advisor to Netanyahu, Erez Tadmor, wrote an entire book about it. I know there is no word for accountability in Hebrew, but is there any way to sanction parties for violating fundamental planks in their platforms?
You vote against them. I mean, you campaign one way and govern another way because you campaign to win votes, and you govern when you suddenly walk in and somebody hands you the keys and you have the problems of a country of 9 million people to deal with. That's part of. It's not easy to win elections, but it's easier to win elections than it is to actually govern. And the way to hold politicians who govern not to one's satisfaction accountable is to vote against them.
Right. It was Sharon, right, who famously said, what you see from here, you don't see from there. Like what you see from the Prime Minister's office, you don't see before you get there. Right.
Yeah, and that's true, by the way, when you're as you change offices. I have like 2 stories I always like to tell students on this. One is an Israeli one and one is an American one. But the Israeli one, I think it was Shaul Mofaz, who was defense minister in one government after being the chief of staff, and then was transportation minister in the next government. And when he was transportation minister, he very briefly ended up cutting it. But they had public service ads on the radio with, I think it was with Raed Salah, about like wearing seatbelts or things like that. And somebody said, in your previous job, you would have been trying to hunt this guy down. And he kind of very sincerely said, yeah, but I was defense minister in the last government and I'm transport minister now. You have to judge me by how I was dealing with national security then and how I'm dealing with road safety now. You don't want me to do my job right. Don't ask me to do a job, and the story I always love is that I always use in my classes is from Madeleine Albright's autobiography, where she talks about how she was the senior advisor to Edwin Muskie when he was the senator from Maine, and then she got hired to work with Cyrus Vance in the State Department when Jimmy Carter became president. And the very last task she had in Muskie's office was to write a letter in Muskie's name against a treaty that the US was about to sign with Canada that was going to negatively affect Maine fishermen. And she says she wrote this letter in complete 100% sincerity. She was crafting the arguments and she believed every word. She wasn't lying. She wasn't being cynical. She wasn't anything. She absolutely believed what she was writing. She wrote the letter. It doesn't have her name on it, of course. It has Muskie's signature on it. When she arrives in her office a week later, now working for Cyrus Vance at the State Department, the first order of business that she had was to write in Cyrus Vance's name a letter back to Senator Muskie explaining why the United States was still going to be signing this treaty despite his objections. And she said she laid out all the arguments why it was important for American strategic interests to be signing this treaty with Canada, even if it was going to negatively affect a few fishermen in Maine. And she says, I, again, absolutely believed in what I was doing, but I was sitting in the State Department when I wrote that letter a week later. She was answering her own letter. Mm. She did both of them from a very sincere place. Each job gives you a different perspective, that's for sure.
Okay, very interesting. So there's a question here. It's a kind of broader political question, I guess, from Jacqueline, who says, is there a feeling that the Israeli population has moved more to the right in recent years?
It's very hard to measure these things. It's a very standard thing to say. I tend to be a bit skeptical of it, but not overly so. On the main issues that define right and left in Israel, which are those having to do with the conflict, the center of Israeli political consensus has, if anything, moved gradually to the left over the last 30 years. I mean, things that were once incredibly radical, like two states, like a withdrawal from most of the territories. And by the way, even on domestic internal issues dealing with the Jewish majority and the Arab minority, things that were once very radical are today very much in the mainstream. And so in that sense, I don't think there's been a move to the right. The right has certainly done a better job winning elections in the last 30 years than the left has. The left and the center have only managed to win elections 3 times, in 92, 99, and in 2006. The right has done a much better job winning elections. And there's a certain disinhibition on the far right that has happened in Israel in recent years. And the example that I gave earlier in the discussion about Ben Gvir and the likes of him, I think is testament to that. There's been a disinhibition in democratic politics throughout the Western world in the last 10 years. I don't know that I can easily identify all the reasons for that, but that's happened in Israel as well. I think that every time that the Israeli public has had to choose between the national interests of the state of Israel and the very narrow interests of the West Bank settler movement, it's always chosen the first. That the blurring of the lines between those two is easy to do in situations where nothing is at stake. For example, when there's no prospect of either a negotiated peace process or of any dramatic unilateral moves. But that each time the public has been tested, we see that there is a very, very, very strongly committed core that is willing to put the interests of the settler movement above everything else, but that they amount to 5 or 10 or maybe 15% on a good day and not more. And even with right-wing governments in power, haven't been able to get their way. But I'm not complacent at all about unpleasant things that I think we're seeing on the margins.
Okay.
To the extent that, like I said, I don't think that lowering the threshold is going to solve the Ben Gvir problem right now.
Okay. There's a question here from Shmuel Yerushalmi. I guess it's what we'd call in Hebrew a tachlis question. Basically, what can be done to prevent the endless series of elections. He's saying in his question, Shmuel, if I can just interpret it a little, that we have this election coming 1st of November, and he's anticipating that it could be the start of another cycle of endless elections, that there'll be another failure to reach an election. We'll have a continued caretaker government. And essentially, is there something that can be done barring something changing which either gives Netanyahu a majority, allows him to have a majority, or which persuades or forces Netanyahu to leave the scene? Because, those seem to be the only two ways that this cycle is going to end. Is there something we're missing?
Well, there is a situation where we're very deeply divided, and we have roughly half of the country thinking one thing and roughly half thinking the other. What can solve that is if there's a decisive outcome in an election, or if there's a decisive outcome in Netanyahu's trial. What can make it easier to live with is something that happens a lot in some other parliamentary democracies, which is minority governments, a government that comes into power possibly with the confidence of the majority of parliament, but is able to survive without that. I think I'm a big believer in minority governments, and I think in Israel it would be an extremely healthy thing to have for a lot of reasons, also having to do with Arab-Jewish relations, because I think that if you have a government that's able to function as a government that had the confidence of parliament and is able to survive no confidence votes, right? And we have if you need me to explain how constructive no confidence works in Israel and what its history is, I will in a second. And if you then have to actually, on an ad hoc basis, build a majority for every major piece of legislation, including for the budget, I actually think this could be a very healthy process for parliamentary democracy. Let the government do what it needs to do, and try to sustain overlapping majorities for day-to-day legislation in the Knesset. I think that's ultimately where we're going to get. If there'll be endless elections, I don't know. We could have one final decisive one. I doubt it. But you have to understand that we have this very weird mix right now of a legal situation and a political situation where both sides sincerely believe, or somewhat sincerely, with varying degrees, depending on who you ask, that the legal process is being used for political ends, or that the political process is being used to circumvent legal realities.
Yeah.
It's very hard to break that.
Now you mentioned that, something we haven't really mentioned actually is the relationship between the Knesset and the executive on one hand, and the Supreme Court on the other. And one of the big issues, aside from Netanyahu, or actually connected, I guess, in certain ways with Netanyahu, is this. It's a kind of dividing line, which roughly, I mean, that there are variations on this, but roughly divides sort of right from center and left, which is to say, on the one hand, one side says the Supreme Court is activist, is overpowerful, is essentially interfering in the decisions made by the Knesset, which, as the elected body, should be the one to make the decisions that it does, and the Supreme Court should not be able to have the power it does to veto legislation. And on the other side of the debate is one that says, actually, we need a Supreme Court which is able to strike down certain legislation, because Israel doesn't have the sort of whole phalanx of checks and balances that some other countries have, and the Supreme Court is necessary to prevent a situation where the majority and the executive can essentially do whatever it likes with no checks and balances on its something to protect, certain liberal values or liberal democratic values. Where do you see that? What's your view on that? Where do you see that debate going, that issue going?
I think if you're a liberal, counting on a powerful high court to protect your values is a very bad long-term plan.
Because it should be done by, because in your view, it should
work in the long term.
Right.
You need to actually win elections. Empowering powerful liberal courts in the short term is just a way of empowering powerful conservative courts in the long term. We've seen countries that have gone down that road. It's not a very good strategy. I think, again, and this isn't special for Israel, there's been a universal trend in the last half century of executive and judicial branches that have become much more powerful at the expense of legislative branches. I think in Israel, it's a particularly acute problem. And if there's anything to take home from all that I've said in the last hour, in case it wasn't clear, I'm a big believer in legislative branches. I'm a big believer in powerful parliaments that have enough members that they can actually do the work they do. And even just from what I said about minority governments, about that being a good thing, I think it frees up Parliament to do a lot of parliamentary business that has been appropriated in recent decades by both governments and high courts, not just in Israel, but around the world, but in Israel particularly acutely.
Okay, so do you think, I mean, that's very helpful. Do you think that in the absence of a written constitution, which, as you say, is unlikely to happen, it would be very difficult for it to happen in Israel. It won't happen, right? So in the absence of that, is there a need to somehow introduce other ways? Because we also don't have a second chamber, right? We have a unicameral system, which I think is quite rare. You'll know better than me. Is that quite rare in parliamentary democracies to have just one chamber?
It's not as rare as you think. Sweden has a unicameral one. New Zealand has one. Yeah, there's a few. Okay,
but given the absence of a second chamber and the absence of a written constitution, and also the very centralized system that Israel has, meaning that we don't have strong municipal governments, we don't have powers given to regions, that kind of thing, as it has in other countries. Is there a need to have? I mean, this would be the argument, I think, for a I don't know if you want to say activist, but a powerful Supreme Court, that you need to have something to act as a brake on the legislature. And do you think there needs to be something, or would you prefer to see a situation where the Supreme Court has less power than it has, and no other changes are made?
There's a very, very, very important role for a court to play, that's for sure. And there's a very, very, very important role for a court to play to make sure that governments don't violate laws. I don't think that's in dispute. The question is not about the relationship between the court and the executive. Right. The question is about the relationship between the court and the legislature, and the relationship between the court, which is supposed to interpret law, and the lawmakers. And there, I think we have a bit of a problem. I accept that there's a role for the court to play. I think it needs to be a considerably smaller one than what we've seen, again, both in Israel and almost across the board in most of the advanced democracies in the last couple of decades.
Interesting. Okay. There's one last question I'm going to put to you. I don't know what you'll do with this one. So Marion says that she makes the case that I'll read sort of what she's written. She says, today it's about little boys playing games who don't seem to realize that 9 million people need to be responsibly governed. And her point is that, I mean, you can extrapolate from what you want from that, but essentially I think she's saying that today's political leaders they're not taking their responsibilities seriously. So I guess the question to you would be, do you think that there's a problem of, aside from all the structural issues, of an absence of decent leadership, of seriousness, an increase in cynicism and political opportunism? Is that something that you think is is increased, or has it always been like this?
I think there's always has been and always will be a very large measure of mediocrity in politics. It's built into the way it's done. It's built into the way democracy works. And it's probably always been with us, with a few exceptions. For Israel and for the Jewish people at large, we have so little experience of political power and political responsibility. And so much experience arguing about comically pointless things without any real political responsibility or power. We don't have 100 centuries long tradition of thinking about public policy. We suddenly had a state in 48 after 30 years of a mandate, but still, it's a complete revolution in how we as Jews think about very, very fundamental social problems. Just to take the most obvious example, it's a complete revolution in how we have to think about something like Shabbat. It's very easy to conceive of Shabbat when you're in a shtetl in Poland and somebody else is responsible for, the basic utilities and services. It's very complicated to think about Shabbat when you're the police and you're the power company and you're the water and you're the army. And yet having a state and having a Jewish state means you have to think about this suddenly. You have to think about it in you can't just throw it away, but you have to think about it in a constructive way. And you have to reconsider a lot of what you thought you knew. But these dilemmas were quite simple in Poland or in Yemen or in Morocco or wherever else. And they're deadly serious here. We had a generation, I think, especially the generation of 48, that did do a lot of thinking about this. But they were exceptional and they were very brief. It's amazing how quickly we went back to being just Jews in our political arguments.
Okay, thank you very much. That was a nice concluding point, sort of overarching historical point. I want to thank Dr. Shany Mor very much for his time, for joining us and sharing that with us. As I said, I'm sure we're going to discuss more about the elections as we get closer to November the 1st. For those of you who are not on my mailing list and would like to be, you can email me, paulg@begincentre.org.il. I've just written it in the chat, and you can join my mailing list and hear more about these Zoom events and other events in English that we do here at the Centre as they come up. I'll be back next week at the same time, and you can find out who the speaker is and where, either on my email or on our website or Facebook page. And I want to thank everyone for joining us. Shany, again, thank you so much. We learned a lot, and it was really useful. I recommend to everyone that they Google Shany Mor and read some of his articles on this. His 2 pieces for Fathom, which will flesh out some of the things that he said today about why he's not a fan of the electoral threshold and other things. So, but read him generally. He's one of my favorite people to read and listen to about Israeli politics and democracy more broadly. So, thank you, Shany. Thank you, everyone. And
thank you very much.